Some people risk their lives trying to get into the EU, where they hope to get asylum. Their numbers have risen again, especially since the Arab Spring and the unrest in Syria.
October the 3rd on the Turkey-Bulgaria border, and someone is about to get shot.
Border police lock up new arrivals. The reason? The migrants crossed the border illegally.
The former army barracks at Hamanli was designed for 430 people. There are 750 refugees currently held here.
Picture this: the EU's poorest member suddenly finding itself on the front lines of Europe's migration crisis, drowning under record numbers of asylum seekers. We're talking about Bulgaria, and by 2023, this small Balkan nation was flooded with 22,500 asylum seekers within a single year, mostly Syrians and Afghans, plus tens of thousands more attempting to slip through undetected. The situation had spiraled out of control. In the forests, makeshift camps appeared. Smugglers became more reckless, smashing police cars and causing fatal high-speed collisions. As desperate migrants paid thousands to cross Bulgaria's borders with Serbia and Turkey, human trafficking networks grew, and fast. The Bulgarian government was overpowered. Their security was jeopardized, and their resources were depleted. This poor country was left to deal with the chaos alone as Europe essentially turned the other way. But then something shocking happened. Bulgaria accomplished what many said was impossible in a single year. It reduced illegal border crossings by more than 60%. Why is that so impressive? Because there has never been a more significant change in a shorter period of time in any other EU nation. So, how did they do it? What bold strategies did Bulgaria put in place? And most importantly, can their approach become a blueprint for Europe's future? Today, we're breaking down exactly how Bulgaria solved its immigration crisis. Bulgaria's most intense immigration crisis in recent memory peaked around 2022. With the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and continued conflicts in the Middle East, waves of migrants trekked across Turkey and set their sights on Bulgaria's 259-kilometer, 160-mile southern border, the gateway into the EU Schengen area. Unlike the highly publicized 2015 refugee surge, which mostly bypassed Bulgaria for other routes, this time Bulgaria got the brunt. The Bulgarian Helsinki Committee recorded 5,268 alleged pushbacks at the Turkish border in 2022, affecting 87,647 people, nearly double the figure from the year before. Smuggling networks took advantage of Bulgaria's relatively isolated border areas, sending migrants from Turkey into the country's Socotra and Stranja mountain regions before continuing on to Serbia. In August 2022, a bus loaded with migrants crashed through a police roadblock in the Black Sea city of Burgas, claiming the lives of 2 Bulgarian officers. By that autumn, the situation was so out of control that officials described it as warlike. The Kapitan Andreevo crossing in nearby areas like the village of Golyam Dervent became hotspots where large groups tried to force their way into Bulgaria. In late 2022, Bulgaria's interior minister called it extreme aggression after the first attack with firearms by migrants, vowing to take a tough stand on defending the border. It was clear that Bulgaria had reached a breaking point, and urgent action was needed. So what steps did they take? And more importantly, how did they do it? Bulgaria intensified its fortress border security approach in response to this assault, putting up a wall in the process. Concerned by a surge of Syrian war refugees, Bulgaria started building a barbed wire barrier around strategic portions of its border with Turkey as early as 2014, following on from Greece 2 years prior. Initially a 30-kilometer pilot project, Bulgaria's intense barrier was progressively made bigger. By 2017, it spanned 201 kilometers of the Bulgarian-Turkish frontier. This steel fence, lined with razor wire and thermal sensors, effectively sealed off nearly the entire land border, and the process cost tens of millions of euros. As expensive as it may have been, Bulgarian officials hailed it as a game changer. And then Prime Minister Boyko Borisov claimed it could cut refugee flows by 7-fold. In 2018, Bulgaria took things a step further by making it illegal for anyone to get within 300 meters of the border, creating a buffer zone. This move, kind of like what happened during the communist era, came along with the construction of a 234-kilometer fence, which reminded some people of the Cold War, when civilian access and surveillance were limited. The idea was to move patrols and pushbacks out of public sight, although it was all framed as a national security measure. Human rights groups like the UNHCR spoke out against the fence, saying it would encourage smuggling and force vulnerable families to take more dangerous routes. They even got emergency calls from Syrians who had walked for days through harsh conditions just to try to get into Bulgaria. But despite the criticism, Bulgaria pushed ahead with its plan, prioritizing security over openness. With the border now sealed off and protected, the country was setting up a more hardline approach to migration. What came next was a complete militarization of the border that would make it pretty much impossible to cross. In 2022, as migrant crossings shot up, Bulgaria sent 350 army troops to help out alongside border police. They also brought in 40 units with military equipment to patrol the forests and backroads where smugglers had been moving freely. The days of police being outnumbered and trying to patrol in the dark were gone. But Bulgaria didn't stop there. They invested a lot in high-tech surveillance. Motion sensors, night vision cameras, and thermal imaging systems that could track crossings even in total darkness. Now, every inch of the border was being watched 24/7. They even got some international help too. In 2024, the EU's Frontex agency sent 240 police officers in border cars to Bulgaria, the first time EU officials were actually patrolling the border, not just working at checkpoints. These patrols weren't just focused on the main roads to Serbia or Romania. They were positioned right on the border itself. This was Europe's way of backing up Bulgaria's tough plan. It was a clear message of a hardline policy, but the real shift came with an unexpected partnership with Turkey. In late 2023, after intense negotiations, Turkey stepped up its border cooperation with Bulgaria by boosting patrols and surveillance. From December 2023 to April 2024, Turkish border guards were stationed along the entire Bulgaria-Turkey border and doing checks on all major routes. The cooperation included intercepting migrant groups, dismantling camps, and sharing intelligence between the two countries. While there wasn't a formal agreement making Turkey Bulgaria's first line of defense, this cooperation was a big change. Bulgaria's once open border had turned into a heavily monitored multinational effort. But here's the thing, physical barriers were only half the solution. Bulgaria's second strategy was just as tough. Make the country so unwelcoming that migrants wouldn't even want to try to enter. This included the controversial practice of pushbacks, where anyone caught crossing the border illegally is immediately sent back to the country they came from, without being allowed to claim asylum or go through any legal procedures. As we mentioned, in 2022 alone, Bulgaria documented over 5,200 pushback incidents involving roughly 87,000 people. While technically against EU rules, Bulgaria treated these expulsions as border enforcement, not human rights violations. For the few who did manage to enter and seek asylum, Bulgaria launched a strict system to quickly weed out any unwanted migrants. A fast-track process rejected 99% of asylum applications from countries considered safe, like Algeria and Morocco. Even refugees fleeing war had little chance. By 2023, Bulgaria granted protection to just 1% of all applicants, turning away Syrians and Afghans escaping conflict zones. And for the few who did manage to get asylum, they were left on their own, with no housing support, no language classes, and no help finding a job. And the government didn't stop at rejecting refugees. They hunted down the networks bringing them into the country. In January 2023, a single raid led to 92 smuggling arrests, shutting down criminal pathways across Bulgaria. President Radev hailed these actions as major national security wins, proudly claiming that cooperation with Turkey had reduced migration pressure. The result? Bulgaria turned into a migration dead end. The message was clear: cross illegally and you'll be sent right back where you came from. So the question is, has Bulgaria's crackdown worked? Well, the data suggests an overwhelming yes. By late 2024, irregular entry attempts dropped by 70% compared to the previous year, preventing about 178,000 migrants in 2023, down to just 52,534 in 2024. On the Bulgarian-Turkish route, the migrant flow almost disappeared. With just 2,688 crossings in the first quarter of 2025, 60% fewer than during the same period in 2024, the trend continued into 2025. Once overrun by nightly invasions, border officials now record numerous days with no crossings at all. Due to fence upgrades, Turkish collaboration, and more patrols, Bulgaria's interior minister has reported that the country's migratory pressure is now at its lowest level in years. years. The most telling statistic shows just how intense Bulgaria's crackdown really was. In 2023, nearly 175,000 pushbacks took place, which is about 2% of Bulgaria's entire population, with migrants being physically expelled from the country. At the same time, a record 22,518 asylum applications were filed, but nearly half of those applicants disappeared before completing the process. This confirmed Bulgaria's role as an unwanted transit route, not a destination for migrants. And during the Ukraine crisis, the selective nature of the approach became very noticeable. Bulgaria accepted more than 1.25 million Ukrainians and granted 52,000 temporary protection status with immediate housing and support, but routinely rejected migrants from the Middle East and Africa. The underlying politics of Bulgaria's humanitarian policies were revealed by this two-track system, which pitted European unity against global South skepticism. One of the most unsettling developments was the rise of civilian migrant hunters, armed vigilante groups that patrolled border areas, using bats and hunting rifles to catch migrants before handing them over to the police. Initially supported by authorities, these groups reflected growing public opposition to illegal immigration and became political tools, pushing for even harsher government policies. Behind these stats is a tragic reality. In 2022 to 2023, at least 93 migrants perished in Bulgaria as a result of asphyxia, cold, violence, and accidents. The human cost of Bulgaria's transition from transit route to fortress, a cost the government considered acceptable for guarding its borders, is represented by these deaths, which were mainly ignored by the mainstream media. In summary, by late 2024, Bulgaria's hardline strategy had delivered undeniable results. Illegal crossings collapsed to just a few hundred successful entries, a fraction of previous year's numbers. The EU took notice, setting aside 600 million euros for external border fortification with Bulgaria's Turkish frontier as a top priority. What began as Bulgaria's controversial experiment had become a European success story. But how did ordinary Bulgarians actually feel about their country's transformation into Fortress Europe? Well, for the most part, it's a story that started with fear but led to approval. From the start, Bulgaria's diverse population supported the crackdown. The rise in migrant numbers between 2013 and 15 sparked widespread fear and uncertainty. Things were made worse by sensationalist media, which often painted immigrants as invaders and criminals. Then, when police officers were killed by migrants in 2022-2023, public support for tougher measures became unshakable. Politicians raced to sound the toughest on migration. Even pro-EU leaders knew that showing any leniency could cost them politically. When the government built fences or abuse allegations came to light, Bulgarians hardly reacted. Local media focused on smuggler arrests and drug busts, portraying Bulgaria as Europe's reluctant gatekeeper. The narrative shifted to one of heroic defense and European security, with Bulgarian leaders proudly claiming they were protecting all of Europe. When Austria and the Netherlands blocked Bulgaria's Schengen entry over border issues, it only fueled the fire. Bulgarians doubled down, determined to prove them wrong. In the end, public concern gave way to a sense of grim satisfaction. While Europe watched, Bulgaria had come up with its own solution. On the evening news, pictures of deportation buses, border fences, and night vision troops became symbols of patriotism. Humanitarian groups like the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee were dismissed as nationalistic and out of touch. The political equation was simple. Votes came from strong anti-migration views. The media kept reinforcing this message. Bulgarian authorities just pushed forward with little internal opposition. But here's the thing. Bulgaria wasn't alone. It was following a proven European playbook for border control. Poland led the way during its 2021 Belarus crisis, building a 186-kilometer steel wall that slashed illegal crossings by 98%. Hungary led the fortress approach back in 2015, sealing its Serbian border with razor wire and effectively ending asylum processing. Greece fortified its Turkish frontier with high-tech surveillance towers and aggressive Aegean patrols. The pattern was identical across all these countries. build barriers, deploy troops, establish buffer zones, and systematically push migrants back. Every nation saw dramatic results. Poland, Hungary, and now Bulgaria all achieved near-zero crossing rates within a year of implementing their hardline measures. What made Bulgaria's approach particularly effective was timing and geography. Unlike Poland, which faced deliberate hybrid warfare from Belarus, or Greece, which couldn't fully seal its island borders, Bulgaria could completely lock down its land frontier with Turkey. The country also operated more quietly than Hungary, avoiding the high-profile EU legal battles that Viktor Orban faced for years. Even Austria, despite not being a frontline border state, actively supported Bulgaria's crackdown through equipment, funding, and police cooperation, particularly in the context of Bulgaria's potential Schengen area accession. Austrian leaders had initially blocked Bulgaria's Schengen entry over migration concerns, but then helped Bulgaria become the filter that would stop migrants before they could reach Austrian territory. The results speak for themselves. Every country that embraced the fortress model saw migration collapse. Bulgaria simply proved that with enough political will, physical barriers, and regional cooperation, irregular migration could be virtually eliminated. But what about the humanitarian costs and legal controversies? Well, some would say that they were simply considered acceptable trade-offs for national security and public approval. But with all of that in mind, can other nations replicate this model to solve their own immigration crisis? Well, the blueprint is there, but context is everything. Bulgaria never claimed to be the only country going through the crisis, but it made it crystal clear early on it would take direct actions other countries weren't willing to take. And as convoluted as the media may try to make it out to be, Bulgaria's formula is deceptively simple. Build barriers, deploy manpower, coordinate with neighbors, eliminate pull factors, and ignore international criticism. Countries from Italy to the United States are already taking notes, but replication isn't straightforward. Bulgaria had unique advantages: a single land border, a cooperative neighbor in Turkey, and migrants who didn't want to stay anyway. Italy can't build walls across the Mediterranean. Germany can't push migrants back without violating Schengen rules. Not every country enjoys Bulgaria's geographic and political luxuries. And there's also a price of success to talk about here. Bulgaria's approach demands sacrifices many democracies won't make. Allegations of brutality by huge foundations like Oxfam, accusations of asylum rights violations, and humanitarian disasters have tarnished the country's reputation internationally. While Bulgarian voters celebrated these tactics, electorates in Germany or Sweden might revolt against such methods. And there's also the resource question. Bulgaria's fence costs millions and requires constant maintenance. Richer nations could afford this easily, but they might face a lot more internal opposition. Bulgaria succeeded because immigration was universally unpopular and the government needed EU credibility. At the end of the day, this is a model, not a flat-out solution. No one can deny that Bulgaria solved its immediate problem, stopping uncontrolled entries. But it didn't solve migration itself. The desperate people are still out there, either looking for other routes through Romania or Greece or trapped in Turkish limbo. Essentially, the restricted border of one nation turns into a new source of tension for another. Bulgaria demonstrated that the fortress concept is effective for national defense when there is sufficient political will. And with legitimacy, it can proudly assert, "We faced a crisis and solved it on our terms." But ultimately, this is a compelling story that resonates far beyond the Balkans and serves as a model that other countries are becoming more and more inclined to adopt. What about why Austria is suddenly declaring war on immigration?